Comrades, hear me. The chains that bind you are not forged of iron alone. They are forged of fear, fear cultivated by the very hands that claim to govern, fear designed to discipline your bodies, your minds, and your spirits. Society would have you believe that submission is safety, that obedience is freedom, that your place beneath the boots of capital is natural, inevitable, and deserved. But I tell you, this is a lie, and a lie made methodical. The architects of this system, the bourgeoisie, do not merely exploit your labor, they exploit your fear. They know that a worker who trembles under the threat of eviction, dismissal, or hunger will labor harder, will police their own desires, will obey the dictates of profit without question. Fear is the invisible hand that guides your actions when the visible hand is too crude, when open coercion would reveal the rot of their empire, from the factory floor to the office desk, from the school to the city street. Discipline is imposed not by benevolence, but by the threat of scarcity, marginalization, and shame. Observe closely, comrades, how the machinery of the state and the ideology of capital intertwine. Laws, policies, and institutions are presented as neutral, rational, necessary, but they serve only the ruling class. They teach you to fear the unknown, to fear the unemployed neighbor, to fear the revolutionary thought, and, above all, to fear your own potential. Every regulation, every headline, every statistic is calibrated to instill anxiety, to ensure that the masses remain divided, insecure, and docile. It is fear made systemic, fear made disciplinary, fear made capital. And yet, understand this with clarity, the very fear they instill is the measure of your power. Fear exists because you possess the ability to disrupt, to challenge, to dismantle. The system fears your collective will. It fears your conscious refusal to accept exploitation. It fears the awakening of the worker as a conscious agent of history. For as long as fear shackles you individually, discipline reigns. But when fear is recognized for what it is, an instrument of oppression, it becomes the spark for resistance. The proletariat, the vast multitude who create all wealth yet own nothing of what they produce, are taught to internalize discipline as morality. Punctuality, obedience, and self-restraint are praised not for virtue, but because they secure capital's unbroken expansion. Workers are trained to submit not through chains, but through guilt, shame, and anxiety, disciplined to labor as if for their own survival, yet always producing profit for another. The system turns your very self-interest into a cage. It is here, comrades, that the revolutionary task emerges. Fear can be understood, dissected, and dismantled. When the working class grasps that their submission is not natural but imposed, when they see that their anxiety is a tool of exploitation, the chains of discipline begin to crumble. Only through collective consciousness, through union, solidarity, and organized action can the fear imposed by the few be transformed into power by the many. Each act of unity, each claim to rightful dignity, each refusal to accept imposed scarcity is a strike against the edifice of fear. Know this, comrades, history is not made by those who obey, but by those who recognize the mechanisms of their own oppression and rise to overturn them. The system depends upon your compliance. It trembles at your defiance. It disciplines you through fear, because fear isolates you. But isolation is a weapon against you alone, not against the masses. Let the workers of every trade, every street, every factory recognize the common source of their fear, and let this recognition become the foundation of revolt. Fear is the smoke, discipline is the fire. Yet both are controlled by those who fear your awakening. When the veil of fear is lifted, the discipline imposed by capital becomes meaningless. The worker becomes master of their labor. The oppressed becomes the architect of their society, and the society itself becomes a reflection of collective human need, not private accumulation. Comrades, the time is now to see fear for what it is, to organize, to unify, and to claim the power that has always been yours. The chains of discipline can only bind you if you allow them to. When the people rise in awareness and solidarity, the empire of fear collapses. Fear is not a mere accident of life under capitalism. It is a carefully constructed instrument of control, meticulously wielded by the ruling class to shape the behavior, thoughts, and even the very consciousness of the working masses. The capitalist system depends not only upon the extraction of labour, but upon the submission of those whose labour fuels its expansion. Without compliance, without the tacit agreement of the many to accept their conditions of life, the machinery of accumulation cannot function. Fear, therefore, is not incidental, it is systemic, embedded within every institution, every workplace, and every social norm. It is the invisible hand that ensures that workers labour not merely for survival, but for the endless enrichment of a class that owns the means of production, while owning none of the toil that creates its wealth. The forms of fear are many, yet each serves the same purpose, to discipline. Workers are made to fear the loss of employment, for the threat of joblessness is presented as the ultimate punishment, a descent into poverty and social invisibility. But this fear is not natural. It is manufactured by a system that deliberately concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a few, while leaving the majority dependent, precarious and vulnerable. Fear of eviction, of hunger, of medical insecurity, and of social marginalization works in tandem with the fear of authority, of punishment, and even of public shame, creating a lattice of anxiety that binds individuals to the dictates of capital. It is through fear that the state and the owners of production ensure that workers regulate themselves, that they internalize discipline, and that they accept the constraints imposed upon their lives as inevitable. This fear is reinforced and perpetuated through ideology. Capitalist ideology presents inequality as meritocratic, suffering as deserved, and submission as virtue. The media, educational institutions, and cultural norms continuously echo messages that frame compliance as normal, moral, and rational. Those who question the system are labelled as dangerous, radical, or irresponsible, while those who obey are celebrated as conscientious, industrious, and respectable. By shaping consciousness in this way, fear transcends the immediate threats of poverty or punishment and becomes psychological, a subtle force that molds desires, ambitions, and self-perception. Workers come to fear not only the external consequences of rebellion, but the internal possibility of defiance, training themselves to remain obedient without explicit coercion. The workplace itself is a laboratory of fear. Surveillance, evaluation, quotas, performance metrics, and the constant presence of authority transform labour into a site of self-discipline. Workers are trained to fear mistakes, to fear inefficiency, to fear the repercussions of challenging supervisors or policies. The disciplinary mechanisms of the factory, the office, and the service industry do not merely measure output. They regulate bodies, time, and conduct, creating docile agents whose labour flows seamlessly into profit. In this way, fear functions as both carrot and stick, compelling productivity while embedding a psychological acceptance of hierarchy and inequality. The worker is taught to self-monitor, to internalize the gaze of authority, and to regulate their own behavior, ensuring that the system perpetuates itself without the constant need for overt coercion. Moreover, fear is divisive, isolating workers from one another and preventing solidarity. By instilling anxiety about scarcity, competition, or failure, the ruling class ensures that workers see each other as rivals rather than comrades, undermining the very possibility of collective resistance. The fear of losing one's position, of being replaced, or of falling behind produces fragmentation, weakening the social bonds that could transform individual discontent into revolutionary consciousness. When workers are isolated, disciplined, and afraid, the ruling class operates with impunity, extracting labour and consolidating wealth, while the many remain entangled in the web of fear that keeps them compliant. Yet, the very existence of fear reveals the power that resides within the masses. Fear is only effective because workers possess the capacity to disrupt, to challenge, to withhold labour, and to demand justice. It is a recognition by the ruling class of what might be an acknowledgement that the collective strength of the working class can overturn the structures that oppress them. Understanding the mechanics of fear is the first step toward liberation. When workers recognize that their compliance is imposed, that their anxiety is manufactured, and that the threats they internalize serve only to maintain inequality, they begin to reclaim agency. Collective awareness and solidarity transform fear from a tool of control into a catalyst for resistance, turning the very weapon used to subjugate into a force for emancipation. The institutions of society, the courts, the police, the state bureaucracy, the schools, the media, and the very frameworks of law and policy do not exist in a vacuum, nor are they neutral arbiters of justice or fairness. They exist to uphold a social order that privileges the few at the expense of the many, to perpetuate a hierarchy in which the bourgeoisie consolidate wealth, power, and influence, while the proletariat remains subordinate, exploited, and disciplined. Law, presented as an impartial mechanism to protect rights, in reality enforced property, capital accumulation, and social stratification. The ruling class constructs the rules of society, and those rules are never designed to protect the worker, the poor, or the oppressed. They are designed to secure the position of those who own the means of production and to maintain the structures that allow capital to reproduce itself indefinitely. Policies are similarly instruments of control. Social programs, labor regulations, and economic policies are often presented as neutral or benevolent, yet they are shaped to manage dissent, maintain social order, and obscure the systemic nature of exploitation. Minimum wages, labor protections, and welfare provisions are offered not to empower the working class fully, but to pacify, to prevent revolt, and to create the illusion of fairness while leaving the essential structures of inequality intact. The law intervenes when workers strike, when unions demand fair conditions, or when the collective power of labor threatens profit, while corporate crimes, tax evasion, and environmental destruction are tolerated, excused, or concealed. The institutions of society are calibrated to protect the interests of those who accumulate wealth, ensuring that any challenge to the social hierarchy is neutralized before it can threaten the status quo. Ideology, the lens through which society interprets itself, reinforces this imbalance. From early education to mass media, ideology teaches the oppressed to accept their place as natural, inevitable, and morally proper. It glorifies competition, individualism, and obedience while framing collective action, solidarity, or resistance as dangerous, irrational, or morally suspect. The narratives of meritocracy convince workers that their poverty is a result of personal failure, that their exploitation is an unfortunate but natural consequence of individual shortcomings rather than a structural imposition of capital. Religion, nationalism, consumer culture, and celebrity obsession all act as ideological tools to distract, pacify, and divide, ensuring that the oppressed look to illusions of status, entertainment, or personal advancement rather than to collective emancipation. Fear, guilt, and shame are codified through these ideological channels, teaching the worker to accept discipline, to internalize subordination, and to perpetuate the very system that exploits them. Even the criminal justice system demonstrates the caste bias inherent in institutional power. Laws are enforced selectively, with the poor punished harshly for minor infractions while the rich are excused, hidden, or given preferential treatment. This creates a society in which obedience is rewarded only when it benefits capital, and dissent or poverty is criminalized. Police serve not the abstract notion of justice, but the concrete interests of property and capital, surveilling and repressing those whose existence threatens accumulation. Prisons, too, function as instruments of control, containing and disciplining those who might challenge the social order, while exploiting their labor in ways that mirror the factory system itself. Education, heralded as the vehicle of opportunity, functions as a conveyor belt of compliance. Students are taught to memorize, obey, and compete rather than to question the structures of power or the legitimacy of inequality. The curriculum instills the logic of capital, normalizes hierarchies, and marginalizes critical thought. By the time workers enter the labour market, they have been disciplined in body and mind to accept subordination, to fear dissent, and to internalize the rules imposed by the bourgeoisie. Every lesson, every rule, every policy has been shaped to reproduce the social relations that benefit the ruling class, ensuring that the oppressed do not recognize the systemic origins of their suffering. Thus, the institutions of society are neither neutral nor benevolent. They are instruments of class domination meticulously crafted to protect the interests of the bourgeoisie while pacifying, disciplining, and dividing the oppressed. They teach obedience, reward compliance, punish defiance, and legitimize inequality. Understanding this is essential for the recognition that the state, the law, and ideology are not impartial arbiters, but mechanisms of oppression is the first step toward liberation. Only when the oppressed see through the illusion of neutrality, grasp the class nature of these institutions, and unite in conscious struggle, can the instruments of subjugation be dismantled and replaced by structures that serve the collective needs of humanity rather than the private accumulation of capital. The submission of the proletariat is not a spontaneous condition of human nature. It is imposed deliberately, systematically, and structurally by the mechanisms of a society organized around the accumulation of capital. The workers are taught to accept their position beneath the ruling class not because it is natural, but because every institution, every social expectation, and every ideological message reinforces the notion that subordination is inevitable, desirable, or morally proper. From birth, the oppressed are conditioned to internalize rules, hierarchies, and expectations that serve the interests of the few while restraining the many. This submission is maintained not through visible chains, but through the invisible yet profoundly effective forces of anxiety, shame, and the internalization of discipline, which shape thought, behavior, and self-perception. Anxiety is the constant companion of the worker. It manifests in the fear of unemployment, eviction, hunger, illness, or the inability to provide for oneself and one's family. These threats are not accidental. They are produced and sustained by a system that concentrates wealth and resources in the hands of the bourgeoisie while leaving the majority dependent, precarious, and perpetually insecure. The worker internalizes the logic of scarcity, believing that survival is contingent upon obedience, punctuality, and productivity, and that any deviation from the norms dictated by capital is a risk too great to take. Anxiety becomes a tool of self-regulation, teaching the oppressed to anticipate the demands of their masters, to police their own labor, and to accept the structures of exploitation as inevitable. Through anxiety, the ruling class ensures that the worker does not act collectively, does not question the system, and does not recognize their shared strength with others in similar conditions. Shame is another instrument by which submission is enforced. Workers are made to feel inadequate, unworthy, or morally deficient when they fail to meet the standards imposed by the system. Whether it is through social comparisons, the ridicule of peers, or the judgment of those in power, shame functions to keep the oppressed in line. It teaches individuals to blame themselves for structural injustices, to interpret inequality as a personal failure rather than a product of systemic exploitation. The poor are shamed for poverty, the unemployed for idleness, and the worker for lacking the skills, energy, or time to escape the very conditions imposed upon them. This emotional manipulation is effective because it produces self-discipline. The worker does not require constant surveillance or threat of punishment, because they have internalized the judgment and regulate themselves according to the expectations of those who benefit from their labor. Internalized discipline operates as the most subtle and powerful form of control. It is the process by which the oppressed absorb the rules, norms, and values of a system designed to exploit them, making them active participants in their own subjugation. Through years of socialization, education, workplace regulation, and ideological conditioning, workers are trained to monitor their own behavior, to anticipate the demands of authority, and to limit their ambition to what is deemed acceptable. This discipline is internalized so completely that the oppressed often enforce it upon themselves without conscious awareness, replicating the very hierarchies and power dynamics that oppress them. It extends beyond the workplace into every facet of life, shaping aspirations, desires, and relationships in ways that reproduce inequality. The worker becomes both the instrument and the object of the system as control, ensuring the continuity of exploitation without the need for overt coercion. It is important to recognize that this imposed submission is neither permanent nor immutable. Its effectiveness relies upon the ignorance of the masses regarding the origins and purpose of their discipline. Fear, anxiety, shame, and internalized regulation persist because the worker is isolated, fragmented, and unaware of the collective power inherent in the class as a whole. The capitalist system thrives on this division. For a population that accepts subordination individually is less capable of collective resistance. The moment the proletariat becomes conscious of its shared conditions, recognizes the artificial nature of its submission, and organizes in solidarity, the mechanisms of control begin to lose their power. Anxiety can be replaced with confidence, shame with dignity, and internalized discipline with collective action, revealing the coercive structure that once appeared natural as an instrument of oppression. The submission of the proletariat, imposed and maintained through anxiety, shame, and internalized discipline, is thus not an accident of human nature, but a deliberate outcome of a social order designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few. Understanding this is critical, for only by identifying the mechanisms that produce compliance can the oppressed begin to break them. When workers see that their subordination is neither deserved nor natural, when they recognize the psychological and emotional tools used to contain them, the potential for collective awakening emerges. The internal chains of fear and shame are broken not by individual effort alone, but through shared awareness, solidarity, and the conscious exercise of class power. Transforming the imposed submission into the foundation for revolutionary struggle, the power of the masses lies not in isolated individuals, but in the conscious recognition of their shared conditions and the organization of their collective strength. Collective consciousness is the awakening of the worker to the reality of systemic exploitation, the recognition that the fear, anxiety, and discipline imposed upon them are not natural or inevitable, but deliberate tools of oppression. It is the understanding that the individual struggles, the daily anxieties, and the pressures to comply are mirrored in the lives of millions, that the suffering of one is bound to the suffering of all, and that the potential for emancipation exists only when that suffering is understood as a shared condition. This awareness is the seed of solidarity, the intellectual and moral foundation upon which organized action is built. Without it, fear continues to dominate, and the ruling class retains control by keeping the oppressed isolated, anxious, and self-regulating. Solidarity is the conscious bond that unites workers across factories, offices, neighborhoods, and social divides. It is the recognition that personal survival cannot be achieved in a vacuum under a system designed to exploit and divide. The bourgeoisie thrives on fragmentation, encouraging competition, distrust, and envy among workers to prevent collective uprising. But when solidarity is forged, these divisions are dissolved, and the oppressed begin to understand their true power. Solidarity transforms fear into a shared understanding of injustice, anxiety into a shared determination to resist, and shame into shared dignity. It allows the individual to see that their struggle is not private but political, not isolated but structural, and that together the working class holds the potential to confront and dismantle the mechanisms of exploitation. Organized action is the practical realization of consciousness and solidarity. It is the mobilization of collective power in a disciplined, strategic, and deliberate manner to challenge the institutions, ideologies, and structures that perpetuate oppression. Organized action takes many forms: strikes, protests, unionization, community mobilization, political engagement, and revolutionary campaigns. Each act of organization weakens the monopoly of fear held by the ruling class, demonstrating that compliance is contingent and resistance is possible. Where individual dissent can be ignored, collective action cannot. When workers refuse to labor, when communities stand together against injustice, when solidarity transforms into strategic coordination, the mechanisms of fear and discipline begin to crumble. Organized action makes visible the power that has always existed in the working class, but which has been suppressed, fragmented, and concealed by the structures of capitalism. This process is not only practical but profoundly psychological. Collective consciousness and solidarity challenge the internalized discipline that the ruling class has imposed. They show workers that the anxieties, self-doubts, and fears that govern behavior are constructed, that they are tools designed to maintain subjugation, and that they can be overcome through shared effort. The worker learns that their strength is multiplied when joined with others, that the systems of fear are contingent upon isolation, and that unity transforms vulnerability into power. Organized action, in turn, reinforces consciousness and solidarity, creating a cycle of empowerment where collective struggle educates, strengthens, and sustains the masses in their pursuit of liberation. Moreover, these tools are inherently revolutionary because they shift the locus of power from the few to the many. Fear is dismantled not merely by confronting individual oppressors, but by confronting the social, economic, and ideological structures that produce fear. The worker who organizes with others begins to challenge not just the immediate conditions of labor, but the entire system that generates inequality, scarcity, and exploitation. Solidarity ensures that these challenges are not fleeting or symbolic, but sustained, strategic, and capable of producing real change. Collective consciousness provides the clarity and vision necessary to understand what is being fought for, why it is necessary, and how the struggle can succeed. Organized action provides the method, discipline, and coordination to make that vision tangible. The interconnection of consciousness, solidarity, and action creates a force capable of transforming society. It allows the oppressed to reclaim power that has been denied, to convert fear into courage, and to convert discipline imposed by the few into a voluntary, conscious, and collective strength. Each worker, each family, each community that recognizes their shared conditions contributes to the growing realization that fear is a weapon designed to be broken, that oppression is a structure that can be dismantled, and that the power of the many exceeds the power of the few. In this way, consciousness awakens, solidarity binds, and action delivers the material means to confront the systemic mechanisms of control, proving that liberation is not abstract, but possible through unity, knowledge, and coordinated struggle. The awakening of the working class is the pivotal moment in the struggle against oppression. The moment when the tools of fear and discipline imposed by the ruling class are recognized for what they truly are and repurposed as instruments of liberation. Fear, which once immobilized the worker, constrained thought, and enforced compliance, loses its power the instant it is confronted with collective consciousness and conscious solidarity. The worker begins to see that what was presented as inevitability is in fact a constructed system of domination, that the anxieties, insecurities, and self-doubt that govern behavior are deliberately imposed to maintain subjugation. This awakening transforms passive submission into critical awareness, individual resignation into communal understanding, and private suffering into political recognition. The oppressed understand that their fear is not evidence of weakness, but an acknowledgement of the latent power they hold collectively, and that this power, when organized, can challenge and overturn the very structures that sought to control them. Unity among the working class amplifies this transformation, creating a force that the ruling class cannot ignore, suppress, or neutralize. The capitalist system thrives on fragmentation, on the isolation of the worker from their fellow labourers, from their communities, and from the larger understanding of systemic exploitation. Competition, jealousy, and distrust are cultivated to prevent solidarity and to make fear effective, ensuring that each worker bears the burden of survival alone. But when the oppressed recognize that their interests are inseparable, that the labor of one contributes to the profit of many and the wealth of the few, isolation dissolves. Solidarity becomes the antidote to fear, the unifying principle that transforms anxiety into collective resolve and shame into shared dignity. It allows the working class to see their common struggle not as an individual failing but as a structural reality, and in this shared understanding lies the seed of revolutionary action. When awakening and unity converge, fear ceases to function as a tool of oppression and instead becomes a catalyst for revolutionary change. The same anxieties that once immobilized the worker now illuminate the injustices that must be addressed. The threats of poverty, eviction, exploitation, and marginalization become the markers of systemic failure, the evidence of oppression, and the motivation for collective resistance. Fear is transformed from a private, paralyzing emotion into a public mobilizing force. It reveals the stakes of the struggle, the vulnerabilities of the system, and the possibilities for its overthrow. In this sense, fear is not eliminated but redirected. It becomes a conscious awareness of risk and opportunity, a recognition of the challenges of revolt and the necessity of solidarity, discipline, and strategy to confront them. This transformation is inherently political and material. The awakened and united working class understands that the tools of oppression are not abstract, but embedded in the institutions, laws, and economic structures that govern daily life. They recognize that factories, offices, and workplaces are arenas of exploitation, that education and media shape perception in service of the ruling class, and that state apparatuses enforce hierarchy and maintain inequality. With this recognition, fear no longer subdues, but informs action. Workers understand that strikes, collective bargaining, protests, and organized resistance are not merely moral imperatives but practical necessities to dismantle the system that exploits them. Fear becomes a measure of potential, an awareness of the obstacles to change, and a guide for strategic engagement. Furthermore, the awakening of the working class cultivates self-confidence, resilience, and moral clarity. As fear is transformed into knowledge and unity, the oppressed realize that they are not powerless, that the structures of capitalism rely on their labor, their compliance, and their silence. Every act of solidarity, every instance of collective action weakens the mechanisms that once held them in submission. The worker begins to see that the instruments of control, economic dependence, social norms, internalized discipline are contingent, not absolute, and that they can be dismantled through coordinated struggle. Fear, once a shackle, becomes the metric by which the worker gauges the strength of the system and the scope of the revolutionary opportunity. Ultimately, the awakening and unity of the working class constitute the turning point in history. The very emotion that was designed to enforce obedience and maintain inequality is repurposed as the engine of liberation. Fear ceases to be the ruler of behavior and becomes the conscience of collective power, the signal that the system's legitimacy is contested, and the energy that drives coordinated, strategic, and sustained action. The oppressed, by recognizing the artificiality of their subjugation and uniting in common cause, demonstrate that revolutionary change is not merely possible but inevitable when fear is transformed into conscious, organized, and collective strength. Comrades, the system has spent centuries teaching us to tremble, to doubt, and to submit, but the lesson it imposes is not eternal. Fear is neither natural nor inevitable. It is a weapon forged to divide, discipline, and control. Yet in recognizing its mechanisms, in understanding the anxiety, shame, and internalized obedience it produces, we uncover the path to liberation. The institutions that claim to protect us only protect the interests of the few, but when the proletariat awakens, sees clearly, and unites, the illusions of power crumble. Our strength lies not in isolated struggle, but in collective consciousness. Solidarity transforms anxiety into courage, shame into dignity, and fear into knowledge. Through organized action, we assert the power that has always belonged to the working class, the power to demand justice, to claim the wealth we produce, and to dismantle the structures that exploit us. Every act of unity, every moment of awareness, every coordinated struggle chips away at the edifice of oppression, demonstrating that the system's power depends entirely on our consent and compliance. The awakening and unity of the masses are the spark that transforms fear from a tool of oppression into a force for revolutionary change. When we stand together, conscious of our shared conditions and determined in our collective purpose, fear loses its dominion over us. It becomes the measure of our strength, the clarity of our vision, and the energy that drives us to reclaim what has always been ours. The chains of discipline, anxiety, and shame are broken not by wishful thinking, but by deliberate, organized, and conscious struggle. Comrades, the power to overthrow oppression, to challenge the logic of exploitation, and to build a society based on justice, equality, and human dignity lies in our hands. The system fears us because it knows that our collective labor, consciousness, and unity are stronger than its institutions, more enduring than its wealth, and more transformative than its ideology. When the oppressed recognize their strength, unite across divisions, and act in solidarity, fear ceases to govern and the revolution begins. History is not made by those who obey, but by those who see the mechanisms of their own oppression, refuse compliance, and rise together in conscious struggle. Let us awaken, let us unite, let us act, and let the fear that once bound us become the fuel that drives us to reclaim our power, reshape society, and create a world where no one is disciplined by the tyranny of fear and all are liberated by the force of collective strength.